Of all the myths that have emerged over the last 112 years, there's one that just never seems to go away. No matter what any of us do or say to the contrary, there is one question that never fails to come up when discussing RMS Titanic. Was third class really locked below deck? First of all, and I really feel the need to emphasize this, despite it being pretty obvious, we need to think of the passengers in third class with respect. I have seen so many terrible assumptions made about them on the internet over the last few years. It's frankly disgusting and probably says a heck of a lot more about the people who make those assumptions than it does about the assumptions themselves. The people traveling third class were human beings, and they unequivocally deserve as much respect as anyone else on board. Just because they couldn't afford a first or second class ticket does not mean they were in any way lesser or inferior, or that any of the crew would have treated them as such. In our modern world obsessed with social issues, history is often one of the first things to get twisted into something ugly in order to fit a narrative. And the truth is, the person pushing that narrative usually never truly understood history in the first place. The myth that passengers in third class were locked below deck in order to keep them from reaching the lifeboats is absolutely not true. This is an idea that has been presented in films and television programs, and naturally, anyone who watches them will automatically accept it as fact, because if it was in a movie, it must be true, right? They forget about little things like dramatic license, or the practice of stretching the truth to emphasize a sense of tragedy. The truth of the matter is, just over 170 third-class passengers survived the sinking, and while it's only a fraction of the number on board, they obviously would not have survived if they were trapped behind locked gates. They survived because they either made it to a lifeboat or were picked up by one. They survived because the ship's officers helped them along with everyone else, without regard to where they came from, what language they spoke, or how much money they had in their pockets, because none of that mattered. What mattered was the life that needed to be saved. So at the center of all this is a thing called the Bostwick Gate. Some of you may know it as a scissor gate. Basically, it's a foldable, lockable metal security gate, and they're usually, but not always, temporary, meaning they're not fixed into place and can be moved as needed. They're still used today, and they're practically everywhere. Construction sites, subways or undergrounds, sports stadiums, storefronts, anywhere that needs an extra level of security or safety may be using one of these. Titanic also used these, just not in the way you may have been led to believe. Gates and doors were used on board Titanic to separate the classes, because passengers were only allowed access to certain areas based on which ticket they held, just like today. They were also used to separate passenger areas from crew areas for practical and safety reasons. However, these barriers on Titanic, particularly the Bostwick Gates, likely didn't pose much of a problem on the morning of April 15th, 1912. Why? Because the Bostwick-style gates were likely only used in crew areas. Similar ones were used in a select number of passenger-accessible areas, but they were meant as safety measures to keep passengers out of places that would have been deemed dangerous to them. Closed gangway door while the ship was at sea? There was a gate in front of it. Potato storage? Gate. Potatoes are important. Elevator? Gate. Vegetable hoist? Gate. Stairway or corridor that led to a crew-only area? Gate. Common stairways that passengers would have used all the time to go about their day? Absolutely no gate. That would have made no sense. Why would the crew want to keep passengers out of spaces they were perfectly within their rights to use? Out on deck, the only thing keeping the different passenger areas apart was a simple system of railings with latchable gates that were only about waist high, and as far as I can tell, usually weren't locked. If someone truly wanted to go beyond one of these gates, they would simply need to reach over and unlatch it, or just climb over it. They honestly wouldn't have been much of a hindrance during an emergency. There is a story of one of these waist-high gates being locked by a steward. It was encountered by third-class passengers trying to make their way up from the forward well deck. However, these passengers simply broke the lock and kept going. So the question you may be asking yourself now is, Well, if these gates and doors didn't keep third class below, why did so many of them perish that night? Well, the tragic truth of the whole situation is that third class slept pretty deep within the ship, and Titanic was a maze of corridors and stairwells that could be very confusing at the best of times. And during an emergency where many weren't even sure what was happening, panic likely made navigating that maze practically impossible. So, the most likely reason why so many in third class were lost that night wasn't because they were held back behind locked gates like the movies would have you believe, but because once the gravity of the situation was realized, there simply wasn't enough time for the passengers to climb 5 or 6 decks to the boat deck to safety. Likewise, there were some who probably felt so lost as to what to do or where to go, they simply resigned themselves to their fate and stayed where they were. The rest had to contend with a catastrophic event and some of the harshest temperatures that spring in the North Atlantic had to offer. For the over 170 people from third class who survived, some were questioned as to whether they were intentionally kept below decks by the crew, and the answer was a resounding no. A steward even testified that when he found a group of third-class passengers who had lost their way, he assisted in getting them up to the boat deck where they needed to be. This entire myth is based on misinformation and misunderstanding, and it really needs to be put to rest. We owe it to the passengers in third class and to everyone on board Titanic to get their stories right. We are their voices now, and they need to be remembered with respect and dignity, not with shoddy research and mass-produced AI work designed for clicks and views. That's why I'll always try to do the best that I can with the information that I present on my channel. I may not always get it right, because no one can be 100% right 100% of the time, but I will always learn, and I will always try. It may seem weird, but Titanic is a subject that is very important to me. I will always take it very seriously, and I will always endeavor to show her the respect she deserves, even when I may approach a topic with just a little bit of humor. Thank you so much for watching. For additional content, you can find me on Instagram at officialhistory401. In the meantime, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to my channel. I wish you all the best, and I hope you'll join me for my next one.